Well, we are going to Matthew chapter 24 today. If you're new with us, we actually started going through Matthew's gospel 2 years ago, and we've been walking through every passage, and we're on pace now to finish right around Thanksgiving time this year. And today, having finished chapter 23, we come up to chapter 24. And chapters 24 and 25 in Matthew's gospel are one big passage known as the Olivet Discourse. And it's called that because it sums up the teachings of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. He gave these teachings toward the end of the day on Tuesday of Holy Week. So this is the week that is going to culminate with Jesus going to the cross on Friday and rising again on Sunday. And so here we are Tuesday evening. Jesus and his disciples are leaving the city of Jerusalem, going across the valley to the east. He sits on the Mount of Olives, and the conversation that's had there is what's recounted for us in chapters 24 and 25. And the main topic in Jesus' discourse here is future events, sometimes called eschatology, or a study of the last things. And as we open up this chapter, I think it's first good to note that we've got to approach this with some humility, because chapter 24 in Matthew is the most highly disputed passage in all of Matthew when it comes to how to interpret it among people who really do believe the Bible and want their beliefs to line up with Bible beliefs. So good, faithful Christians disagree on how to interpret this. They disagree on the whole field of end-time prophecy in general, just because the texts are hard to interpret, and there's a lot of symbolism in a number of the texts. So there are some real difficulties when it comes to figuring out what these things all mean. And so that means that if you are a student of Bible prophecy, there's a decent chance that you'll disagree with some of the interpretation that I offer today. And we want you to know that that's no problem. I think when it comes to these difficult and disputed nuances of Christian beliefs, we start to wonder, well, what do all Christians believe? And we can get some guidance from the historic creeds. And those were written when Christians came together and they agreed on the essential things that you can't deny and still call yourself a Christian. And when it comes to these last things, the core agreement among all Christians from all eras is summed up in the line of the Apostles' Creed that we just read, where it says, "From there he will come to judge the living and the dead." So for all of our disagreements on what end-time events will look like, the one thing that all Christians have said, we're not going to deny this, we all agree on this, is Jesus is coming. We all agree that there is a future coming of Jesus, that he will return and judge all people, that's a literal future coming. He's literally coming back. That's not something that happened in our past. That's not a metaphorical or spiritual return in the future. It's a literal future return of Jesus and a future judgment that Christians are waiting for and anchoring our hopes in. But what's disputed is what happens between now and then. Some people among faithful Christians think things will get better before he returns. Some think things will get worse. Some think it's going to be a combination of better and worse throughout the whole era. There are debates about a period of tribulation at the end and a millennial reign of Christ toward the end. There are debates about how to interpret the symbolic elements in prophetic texts like the book of Revelation. And again, all among faithful, believing people. And so the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to focus mainly on Matthew 24 and 25. So that means that we won't cover every topic related to eschatology. This won't be like an exhaustive lecture on the end times. It'll be limited mainly to what Jesus talks about in chapters 24 and 25. And so if you're hoping for a lot of talk about the rapture or millennium or Antichrist or Kirk Cameron or getting microchips in your forehead or hand or whatever, you're going to be really disappointed. We can't cover everything, and we do want you to get home by kickoff today. So we are going to focus on Matthew 24 and 25 mainly this week and in the 2 weeks to follow. And what we don't want to do is look at a text and say, oh, there's so many disputes about this text. Why don't we just skip over it? Why do we just not cover it? Because the truth is, all of our Bible reading, we're going to run into texts where we don't understand everything there. And we don't want to skip those things. We just want to glean what we can as we go. And each time we read through it, we glean a little bit more and we make a few new connections, and we want to do the same thing as we teach. We don't want to just ignore these chapters, because as much as we won't solve every mystery that's there, these chapters are rich with resources that will help us persevere in the Christian life faithfully now. They're loaded with resources for living in anticipation of the return of Christ that we can't set a date for, but that we should live in anticipation of. And we definitely won't get it all, but there are some really valuable things that we can get as we go through here. So now that I've lowered your expectations, let's get into Matthew chapter 24. I spent a lot of time studying this past summer over sabbatical, and I was most helped by the interpretation that was offered by theologian D.A. Carson. I put a link to his lectures in the sermon manuscript if you want to listen to a more in-depth thing, but I will be drawing on that quite a bit over the next few weeks. And so let's just jump in. We'll start with the first two verses here. Matthew 24, verse 1. It says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So Jesus and the disciples are leaving the temple complex. The disciples are doing what any visitor might do. They're noticing with awe the magnificent buildings there. The complex was huge. At that time, it took up 35 acres. It was built with white limestone. It used all kinds of lavish construction techniques. It had been expanded and renovated in 20 BC, about 50 years before this. This temple building was a sight to behold. But Jesus had just had a long day of run-ins with the temple leaders. They put him through the ringer. They tried to trip him up. They tried to get him arrested. They were trying to make him say something foolish or say something to get him in trouble. And so he finished his day in the temple by denouncing them and denouncing the Christless religious system that they were overseeing. And so now when the disciples are looking at the temple and they're saying, "What a great temple," Jesus says, "It's all going to be torn down." The temple and the whole system of the priesthood and the sacrifices was designed by the Lord in the Old Testament to symbolize the coming sacrifice of Christ. The blood of the sacrifices was meant to symbolize the blood of Christ that would be spilled. The way that God dwelled with his people in the temple was to symbolize the fact that God would come and make his dwelling among us in Christ. The whole thing was put in place to be a shadow of Jesus so that when Jesus showed up, he would be recognized. But the leaders of that system would soon be participants in the crucifixion of Jesus. They had one job, which was to point to Jesus, and they were dramatically failing at it. So this era of faith being centered around that temple was going to come to an end with the temple's destruction, which is what Jesus predicts really clearly in verse 2, that there's coming a day where not one of these stones, these specific temple stones, will be standing on top of another. And that was in the future when Jesus said it, but it's well in the past for us. A few decades after Jesus made this prediction, the Jews in Jerusalem revolted. They revolted against occupying Rome. This was in about 66 AD. Rome decided that they weren't going to take this anymore, so they gathered their legions and they moved toward the city around 68 AD. They surrounded Jerusalem. They trapped everybody inside. They laid siege to it. There was famine and disease and civil strife inside the city. And then when they had starved and terrified and worn out all the people who were in the city, in August of AD 70, the Roman soldiers broke through the walls of the city. They burned what could be burned in the temple. They tore down the stone walls, and they leveled it down to its foundation. According to historian Josephus, there were over 1 million people in the city when it was laid siege to because it was the Passover time, and every single person in that city who wasn't killed was enslaved or taken away to Rome. Nobody escaped. And now Rome celebrated this as a great victory. The Arch of Titus that still stands in Rome today commemorates these events. It depicts Roman soldiers carrying off the sacred temple furnishings like the table of showbread and the menorah. So the Romans celebrated this, but the Jews, of course, saw this as a world-changing, era-ending tragedy. This was the greatest cataclysm they'd seen. There weren't as many Jews put to death as during the Holocaust or by Stalin, but the genocide in 70 AD was more thorough because everybody was affected. Everybody was wiped out or carried away. It was a huge cataclysm. Their temple came down. This was the end of the Jewish temple system. It was the end of their nation. It scattered the Jewish people, and it shaped both Judaism and Christianity forever. So Jesus starts in the Olivet Discourse by predicting that day. He's saying a day is coming when every stone in this temple will be torn down. And though we won't get to verse 34 till next week, in verse 34, Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place." And everywhere else in Matthew where Jesus talked about this generation, he was talking about the people who were alive then. And so a straight literal reading of this generation will not pass is saying that these things will happen in this generation. So the disciples hear that prediction. They're in awe of the buildings. Jesus says it's all going to be torn down. And the disciples hear that and they think, well, the destruction of their nation and the temple must coincide with the end of the world. They can't imagine anything more cataclysmic than that. I mean, if the temple's being torn down, surely that's the end of the world. Surely Jesus is coming back then. And this isn't a crazy way to think. I think we would think the exact same way. Like if we think about Washington, D.C. falling, we almost automatically will think, well, that's going to happen at the end of the world. It's going to happen like when nuclear war is going on or something world ending. So Jesus says the temple will be destroyed. They think he must be talking about the very end of the world, and they ask a question that frames this whole chapter, and in that question, they mix a question about the destruction of the temple and a question about the end of the world. So verse 3, it says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, these things that he just talked about, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So these things are the destruction of the temple. And they say, what will be the sign and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of this age? And so in their mind, this is all one question. When's the temple going to be destroyed and our world going to end and you're going to come back? But for us, from our perspective, we know that these are actually two questions. Because the temple was destroyed 1955 years ago, but the Lord has not come back yet. They thought it would all be at the same time. We see that clearly it's not. And their mixing these two questions together is what makes this chapter difficult to interpret. Because Jesus answers both questions about the destruction of the temple and also questions about his future coming at the end. And it's tough to know in this chapter which parts are about that 70 AD destruction of the temple and which parts are about his final return in judgment. So that's what makes it hard, but let's just walk through it. They ask their question, when will the temple be destroyed and what will be the sign of your coming? And Jesus responds, first of all, verse 4, Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So first, Jesus says, don't be led astray about these things. End time hysteria often bubbles up. And most of the great cults in history were started by someone who had their date where they were predicting the end of the world. And then when the end of the world didn't happen then, they would kind of revise it and either come up with a new date or say, well, that was the end. It just kind of ended in a spiritual, figurative kind of way, or Jesus came back spiritually or something. All kinds of deceiving teachings about end times bubble up. And you can find writings during almost every historical upheaval where someone is absolutely sure that this must be the end. They wrote that way during World War I, during World War II, before the year 2000, after 9/11. And it seems like this was worse in the 80s and 90s, but still today, you'll hear a preacher say, well, this war, this is a sign of Jesus' return. Or this increase in earthquakes and natural disasters, especially when it's in the United States for some reason, those are all signs that any minute now, Jesus is going to be coming back. But notice what Jesus says about these signs. Verse 6, he says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. In verse 8, he says, all these are but the beginning of birth pains. So Jesus is describing here an era which that generation saw beginning to unfold, an era in which bad things will happen, like wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, but those are not the sign that the very end is here. In fact, rather than those things being the sign that the end is right here, Jesus says they're not that sign. The end is not yet here. He says that those events are just, quote, the beginning of birth pains, that those big upheavals are like the beginning of labor pains, but not the final arrival of the baby. And this language, where he talks about this being an era of birth pains, this was common language for them because they had in their philosophy, in their teaching, in that period between the Old and New Testament, some teaching that there was going to be an era of upheaval that they actually called an era of birth pains before the Messiah came. And so you can read in some non-biblical books like Baruch, chapters 27 through 30, talk about the beginning of the birth pangs. And he describes an era of upheaval with natural disasters and wars and rumors of wars that's all going on before the Messiah comes. So all those bad things are like birth pains, and then the Messiah coming is like the baby being born, and that's where the joy is. And so Jesus says here that this generation, the generation that was standing right there, will see all these things, but these things are not the end. He says these are the labor pains before I return. And my understanding of the structure of this whole passage, convinced by D.A. Carson here, is that verses 4 all the way down through verse 28, Jesus is describing what things will be like in the entire era between his first coming and his second coming, with a brief focus on the events of 70 AD as one particularly sharp birth pain. And then when we get to verse 29 through 31, I think they're describing the literal future coming of Jesus at the end of that long era. And then verses 32 all the way through chapter 25, he goes back to describe how we should live in anticipation of his coming and judgment. And now this passage doesn't mention or rule out a millennial reign of Christ, a tribulation period near the end. In fact, all the main views of how things will play out between now and his return seem to fit with what Jesus is teaching here, so it doesn't necessarily give us guidance on those things. But the 30,000-foot view of the future that we get here is that there will be a long era of birth pains from the first coming to the second coming of Jesus, and at the end of it, the end of those birth pains, is his return in judgment. And I know this is like super nerdy so far, and I have spared you actually a lot of the technical analysis that leads me to believe that this interpretation is right. But again, I did link D.A. Carson's lecture series on there, so if this is something that is just like sucking you in, I would encourage you to listen to those lectures. But here's where it becomes significant for us. Jesus is describing the kinds of things that happen between the time of his first and second coming. And because we live in that era, this can help us set our expectations for the Christian life. And this is one of the key reasons behind all the end time prophecy that's given to us in the Bible, is that end times prophecy often has an encouragement to us to persevere. Verse 13 we'll get to, right in the middle, there's a call to persevere. Throughout the book of Revelation, we see calls to hold fast, to conquer. You see a call in chapter 13 of Revelation for patient endurance. A primary reason that we are given any predictions about the future at all is to help us know what to expect and to help us persevere through them. Knowing what to expect helps us persevere. If you go in through a major surgery, before you go in, the doctor will probably tell you ahead of time what to expect during your recovery. And they might tell you, the pain and the recovery is actually going to get worse before it gets better. Day 4 could be the worst, and then from there you might start to climb out of it, but there will be advances and setbacks. They kind of let you know what that whole recovery will be like, so that way when day 4 comes, you can say, all right, I expected this. And it helps you endure. It helps you know nothing has gone wrong, everything's going according to plan. Knowing what to expect helps you persevere. And in my pastoral experience, the number one thing that causes people to stop persevering and to quit on the Christian life altogether is disillusionment that things didn't go the way they expected them to go. Where we have one set of expectations for how things will go for us as Christians, things go a different way, and so we storm off in anger or despair. We have a lot of our expectations for what the Christian life will be like influenced by the false teaching of the prosperity gospel that promises the wrong version of the good life. Or we're learning our theology mainly from TikTok influencers who take positive Bible verses out of context and give the impression that the entire Christian life is nothing but wins and triumphs. Or we've just been told the positives and not been told any of the warnings that Jesus gives here. There was actually a good article in USA Today yesterday that was celebrating the resurgence in church attendance in our day. And it highlighted some of the proven effects of church going and the effects of a church on a community. And it points out things that we've known for a long time, that the presence of a church in a community increases the amount of volunteerism there. It increases the cultural vibrancy and cohesion. The average church in the rural South adds $735,000 in economic value to a community. Churchgoers have an 18% higher degree of life satisfaction than non-churchgoers. Among churchgoers, there are dramatically reduced rates of deaths of despair. There's a big decrease in loneliness. Churchgoers report having better sex lives. And the statistics have been around for a long time. They're almost indisputable. The things are true. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, they undersell the value of a church and a community. The core beliefs that hold the society together have been fueled historically by the teachings of the Christian church. I'd recommend the book, The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener, where he talks about how the fact that we believe in freedom and progress and equality all come from the historic influence of the Christian faith. And so all that's true. And in the face of the bad rap that I think a lot of churches get, or that churches in general get, these are important pieces of information. But the way to picture Christianity is it's a big ship that's headed in the right direction, but often there's chaos on the deck. And we need to be prepared that, yes, over time, the church triumphs and wins and the gospel gets preached all over the place. God does good things through his people. The influence is a good one. You are the salt of the world. But we also need to be prepared for the times when close community gets corrupted somehow. When church seems to cost you friends, when the marriage never comes your way, when you give financially and don't receive back, when your life satisfaction actually goes down because of some of the hardships that come with church, when you have those run-ins with inauthentic believers. I mean, those things in the USA Today are generally true, but what happens when the brochure doesn't match reality for you? What often happens is we smack up against reality and we say, what the heck is this? This is not as advertised. I want out. I want my money back. But Jesus here gives a realistic picture of the time we live in, the time between his first and second coming, so that we can be prepared, and so that we can persevere, and so that when we go through some of those times where reality doesn't match the brochure, we can say, okay, no, Jesus actually did tell us that this kind of thing is coming. So what can we expect in this era? What are these birth pains that he's talking about? Well, we've already read about a few. Verse 5, he says that there will be false teachers and false promises. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. So this is an era of false prophets and false Christs. Jesus is going to mention them several times as we go through this passage, and he's going to conclude this section in verses 23 to 28 by mentioning them again. And by mentioning them at the beginning and the end, it's actually a literary device called inclusio, where it's like putting verbal brackets on a section. So it's one more reason to believe that verses 4 through 28 are a bracketed section where Jesus is describing this era. And he says that in our era, many will come in the name of Jesus and will lead people astray. And they do so by claiming to be Christ, and that can be someone actually claiming to be Jesus Christ himself, but Christ just means anointed one. And so this isn't limited to people claiming to actually be Jesus himself, but those teachers who claim to uniquely get it, to have a unique anointing to teach or to lead, that they alone can understand some portions of Scripture. Their church or their movement is the one that really gets it, and they really do everything right. And it's not uncommon, especially in our day when churches can produce a lot of really great media, for a church to look so good or for a pastor to look so compelling that well-meaning Christians might pack up and move across the country or around the world to be with the one true church that they finally found. And it's like they're saying, look, here's the Christ, there he is. They look so much more exciting than their boring church. They look so much more pure than their church that seems to have so many sins among the people that they actually know. But when we think, well, that's the one, That's the place where there is no sin. That's the anointed place that always ends in disillusionment. Because you get close and you realize that there's sin there too. So Jesus says it's going to be an era of false Christ. It's also an era of wars and natural disasters. Verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. These things will go on in the broken world that we live in. They're not signs that the end is here right now, but they're birth pains. And birth pains are painful reminders of a coming joy. There is coming that day when Jesus returns. And so every natural disaster that we read about, everything that we go through that's a real trial is a birth pain. It's a reminder that the end is not yet here, that we don't yet have the full joy, but that the full joy is coming. So we can expect in our era false Christs and false teachers, wars and natural disasters. We can expect Christians to be opposed. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. All these things, by the way, happened in their generation to the apostles. We can read about them in the book of Acts, but then they've continued through our day. And we've been kept relatively safe from a lot of this, but more Christians were put to death for their faith in the last 100 years than in all previous centuries combined around the world. So the good news of the gospel and the people who believe it will be opposed in this life. This won't be an era where all we do is win, but it'll be an era where bubbling up like birth pains, there's real opposition. At times, it'll be bad. At times, it'll be deadly. At times, it'll be full of hatred. And maybe we haven't experienced anything close to that, but I can't imagine the temptation toward disillusionment if someone's in that boat. They've given their life to this Christianity, and then all of a sudden, they're losing their life for it. Jesus says that's what it's going to be like. Verse 10, and then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. I mean, this is always heartbreaking to see the number of people who seem to be walking closely with Jesus and then walk away. You know, there was a big wave of people who seemed to be walking with Christ side by side with me in high school, and many have turned from the faith. There's been a big wave of people in our culture that left the faith over issues related to sexuality. And then day by day, there are people whose lives are just hard, and they feel like the hardness of their lives must be the evidence that Jesus isn't real, and so they walk away. And we can think, well, something's going wrong. It can feel like the ship is sinking. But Jesus says this era of birth pains will be an era where many turn from Jesus and the love of many grows cold. He also says it'll be an era of relational strain, that many will betray one another. And so this should set our expectations about church life. Sometimes we can have this idea that church is a uniquely sin-free zone where human depravity and original sin almost like don't have any influence at all. And if you just do church right, then it will be a perfect utopian community. But that's a false promise, and it's not the promise that Jesus makes. It makes the leaders out to be little Christs. It makes the community out to be heaven, and neither one of those things are true. But Jesus says in this era, people will try to lead us astray. They'll betray one another. In Mark's account of the Olivet Discourse, he writes that Jesus also says in Mark 13:12, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death, and you'll be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So we have to be aware of the kind of promises that churches can make where we say, you know, our church gets all of its teaching exactly right, and therefore we are the ideal community. Our church has hacked family, and if you do things exactly like we call you to, then your family is guaranteed to turn out perfect, like these shiny, happy people, that we can do it, we've got it right, and so just follow our model, and there's a guarantee. Listen, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot of sowing and reaping laws that apply to family interrelationships. but there's no guarantee for our era that there won't be relational strain. There is no guarantee that even if we do a lot of things right, that things won't go wrong. And as church friends become not friends at all, we can feel the pain. But the doctor did tell us that pain like that was coming. Now I know this has been bleak so far, but look at verses 13 and 14. He says, "But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So right in the midst of it, there's the worldwide spreading of the gospel. So in this era of calamity, with Christians under pressure, relationships strained, in this era full of heartbreak, God's at work. In the church, with all of our sins, with all that's always falling apart, we'll take the good news of Jesus to the entire world. And it's actually possible now for the first time that the Bible will be translated into the heart language of every people group on earth. That could happen in our lifetime. Like, it's moving so fast right now. Our church supports a ministry called The Seed Company. Go to their website and look at the stats. It's moving quick. They're starting to use AI. There's like all kinds of things that are moving Bible translation faster than it's ever moved. And so the good news of the gospel is being preached through all the world. And this is despite all the chaos on the deck of the ship. And so this is an era where the church works to build and progress gets torn down, and then the church builds again in the rubble, because God's Spirit doesn't leave his people. He keeps working through the chaos, and we've seen this play out, and I know we are just like the smallest little fraction of what God is doing in the world, but again and again, I feel this every time I announce we're gonna be doing baptisms here. Here's the faithless thought that goes through my head is, who's gonna get baptized? Like, I've been so distracted by relational strains, by being with people whose lives are in crisis and under pressure, by dealing with false teaching, by people leaving the faith, by families under pressure. All this stuff feels like it's so distracting from the mission. And then we announce, hey, if you've come to faith in Jesus, come get baptized. And I think, well, there's not going to be anybody. Like, we're not doing anything. The mission isn't moving forward. And then the staff will tell me, hey, 17 people signed up to get baptized. Like, God just keeps working in the midst of the chaos. Through all the pain, God's at work. He's with us in those trials, and God doesn't abandon his church. All right, now verse 15. Here, Jesus focuses in on that one particularly sharp birth pain that came early in this era of birth pains, the one the disciples asked about. And I think what he's talking about in 15 through 21 here is specifically the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So verse 15, he says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is in the housetop not go down to take what's in his house, and let the one who is on the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." Now, this doesn't rule out any tribulation that will happen in the future, but I think what he's talking about here was what happened in 70 AD. In Luke's account, Jesus also included details about the city being surrounded by armies. He said, when you see these things coming to pass, get out of Jerusalem. And historically, a number of Christians who believed these words fled, and they escaped that destruction of Jerusalem. The people who didn't believe these words, who stayed in Jerusalem, experienced a destruction that was so horrible that this week when we were talking it over with the staff, some of the things that happened to people in that city, they asked me to please not mention those specifics in the sermon because it'll be way too distracting from the rest of the content. It's too horrifying and too troubling to even think about. But it was awful. I mean, up to 1 million people were starved and killed and carried away as captives. It was great trouble, great tribulation, so thorough and complete that nothing has ever compared. A huge birth pain that generation experienced. And then in verse 22, Jesus is talking about these things, the whole big era again, and he says, "And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So all during this era, false teachers, false Christ will come. People will say, here he is, there he is, finally at work here. And Jesus says, don't believe. He says, our hope is not that the Christ is going to come in kind of a secret way and sneak into our era. He says, we'll know when he comes back. It'll be like lightning that flashes in the sky that you can't miss. It'll be like a venue of vultures circling over a corpse so you can look down and see exactly where the corpse is. We're in this era of birth pains, and he says it will be very obvious when that era ends and he returns. In fact, look at how obvious. Verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, some people have said that this is symbolic and that this actually happened in 70 AD as well, but that seems like a massive stretch. The whole point here is that when this happens, it'll be really obvious to everybody. Like when lightning flashes, we will know that this happened. And so if we think that this happened in 70 AD, that's almost like a really non-obvious return of Jesus. And his point here is there's going to be a return, and it's going to be obvious. There are going to be many troubles and trials that every Christian sees in this era of birth pains. But at the end of the birth pains, there's a birth. There's a joyful occasion. And this passage doesn't make sense if there's nothing joyful at the end of the birth pains. That's the point of that whole analogy. And the joy that we can fix our hearts on is that in the future, the Lord will return. He's going to send out his angels. He's going to gather his people. Just like his prediction that the temple would be destroyed came to pass, his promise that one day he will return for us will also come to pass. In John 14, verse 1, Jesus said, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you that I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And that's guaranteed. And that's our hope. That's our hope for all the trials that we walk through, that Jesus will accomplish everything he came to do. I mean, he saw our sin and the worldwide pain that it created. He saw the betrayals. He saw the upheavals. He saw the evil in us. He saw the curse that was over the whole creation because of sin, with the natural world itself creaking and groaning with earthquakes and famines. And he came on a mission to redeem, to pay for our sin at the cross, to die for sin that he never committed, to be buried and to rise again, and to redeem all of those who would believe in him. And though we're in this world of pain now, though we're in this era of birth pains, at the end of the birth pains comes the joyful thing. It comes the birth. And so our hope is not that it will be easy to follow Jesus here. It's that one day he will return to take us to himself. Our hope is not that we'll be able to fix the fact that we're living in this era of pain and upheaval. Our hope is that he returns. And while we wait, he really is at work with us and among us. Our hope is not that we can fix this life, that this life will be easy, that we can do Christianity right or church right so that there will be no more sin or strain or heartbreak or loss. Our hope's in him. Our hope's that he's at work even when we can't sense it. He's making sure his gospel gets spread throughout the world. He's making sure that his church triumphs in her mission to spread the good news. and that one day he will unmistakably return for us. And so rather than be disillusioned when things go bad, remind yourself that he's at work. Remind yourself of the hope that he'll return. Rather than believing that someone or some church holds out the hope where everything is perfect there, set your hope on him. Guard against the deception of false teachers and false promises and false hopes in our day. Don't go after them, but don't be a pessimist either. Anchor your hope in the return of Jesus and the sure thing that he keeps all of his promises and that he will return. And to strengthen our faith in the midst of all this waiting, the Lord gave us the Lord's Supper. Before going to the cross, he gave his disciples this observance where we share this bread in remembrance of his body that was torn. We drink the cup in remembrance of his blood that was spilled to pay the price for our sins. So when we take this supper, we're remembering the faithfulness of Jesus to us. We're remembering how when we weren't good friends, how when we betrayed him, he had come and died and paid the price for our sin. And so if you've confessed your known sins and you've believed that your only hope in drawing near to God is Jesus and what he's done, we welcome you to take the Lord's Supper with us. If you don't believe those things, if you don't believe in Christ or you haven't confessed your known sins, you're not anchoring your hope in him, then we would encourage you not to take this. This isn't an observance for people who are perfect by any means. This is an observance for people who recognize our only hope is Christ. But we have hoped in him. And not only is this a remembrance, but it's also a foretaste. One day we're going to feast with him. He's going to return for us. And the book of Revelation describes that day as a wedding supper of the Lamb. We're headed toward a feast. We're heading toward a party. We're heading toward union with him. And this is just like almost a little appetizer of that day when we get to feast with him when he returns.